Hello, and welcome back to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. The last couple of episodes seem to have been really popular with you all, which is great. As always, please put your enthusiasm for the podcast in writing by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. This is the best way to get the podcast seen by as many people as possible. Today's episode concerns a man who is, quite simply, horrible. Rodrigo Duterte has killed more people, it is estimated, than any other Southeast Asian leader since Pol Pot. He is, of course, the highly bellicose leader of the Philippines, having been elected in 2016. Renowned for his boisterous communication, Duterte is best known in the West for his attitude towards drugs. Indeed, it's fair to say that Duterte's drug policies would have made Nancy Reagan sound like Pete Doherty. Duterte has allowed policemen to murder, without evidence, people suspected not merely of drug dealing, but drug taking as well. Whilst this element of Duterte's presidency is the most eye-catching for story-hungry Western journalists, many other elements of Duterte's programme are interesting and alarming. His attempts to deal with Islamic terrorism in his country, for example, or his dislike of the Philippines' traditional ally, the United States, or, perhaps most intriguing of all, his attempts to get his children into high office after his own presidency ends. This is building up to what will be one of the strangest elections in recent memory next year, when it appears possible that the daughter of Duterte and the son of former Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos might battle it out for high office. If things couldn't get any stranger, the man best positioned to stop them might be world-famous boxing legend Manny Pacquiao. My guest for today is an expert on Filipino politics and culture. He is Tom Smith of the University of Portsmouth. At Portsmouth, Tom is a principal lecturer in international relations and terrorism studies, and is also academic director of the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell. Few people are better placed to answer questions about the Philippines, and our discussion is wide-ranging, covering drugs, terrorism, corruption, diplomacy, and the next election. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Rodrigo Duterte. Hi Tom, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much.
Good stuff. Let's talk about Rodrigo Duterte then, Tom. He's somebody who's attracted a lot of attention in the West for his very direct, provocative style. He's often compared to Donald Trump. But I think even people that know of him, and I'd include myself in this, don't know a great deal about the politics of his country or the context in which he's come to power. How would you describe the culture, the political culture of the Philippines to an outsider?
Crikey. It's very different. It is idiosyncratic. And while it borrows, like in its political system, the actual architecture of the country borrows from different countries. So it's got sort of British influences, it's got heavy American influences. Those have all kind of bled itself into a cocktail, just like the rest of the country, which has large Spanish influences from its colonial days as well. A real sort of unique cocktail of the country. And when you are a politician or any sort of public figure in the Philippines, grabbing attention, grabbing headlines, making sure your message gets out to a large population of people. Across a very disparate, physical geography and human geography of a nation is difficult. And I think the tendency has been, after the Second World War, for politicians to just get more and more gregarious and lean on a kind of a celebrity culture and a way of being as sensationalist as possible, so that they can grab the microphone, so that they can get well known in the provinces as much as possible, because otherwise I think it's very difficult for a politician in the Philippines to have much of a national brand or have much name recognition on a national level. It's one of the things you have to really think about with the Philippines. It really does help. It's one of those countries that really helps to look at a map of the place, and you see, it's all these sprinkled across islands in the Pacific. Many of these outer remoter islands and provinces away from Manila are underdeveloped by comparison. They wrestle with a huge plethora of major developmental issues, from poverty. We have absolute levels of poverty in the Philippines. Large areas of slums in Manila, and then just outside in the rural provinces. Natural disasters, there's a communist insurgency, there's an Islamist insurgency. I mean, you name it, and the Philippines really has got it. And so when you're a politician, you're competing for headlines and getting something across to a population which is so different. I mean, there's a number of different languages spoken, for instance, in the country. I mean, Tagalog is kind of the language, along with officially recognised English, but only sort of people that stay in their education for a few years would develop a decent standard of English. But any traveller there would know that it's quite easy to get around. But if you're a politician, you have to play to lots of different crowds, and so the culture itself isn't unified. Other than you get gregarious characters who try to celebritize their message, celebritize politics. And Duterte isn't the first to have done this, and he won't be the last looking at the election to come. And so it's kind of that backdrop. You have to understand that politicians exist. And it's easy, I think, for Western commentators and observers to slip into cheap, stereotypical, it's just like Imelda Marcos back in the day, and her shoe collection and all the rest of it. It's just history repeating itself. I think underneath that belies a much richer understanding of the Philippines, which I'm still developing, after all these years. And even, Filipino experts will tell you it is complex and depends on the region, depends on the issue. So it's within that backdrop that I understand Duterte.
He's been president of the Philippines since 2016. To get a bit more of a flavour of the man himself, what do you think is important to know about his life before the presidency to understanding the sort of politician that he is?
I mean, I don't like to sort of do this sort of history biography bit, but nevertheless, you have to, I think, with Duterte, because he kind of painted himself as this sort of outsider character who was going to take on politics, and a bit like Donald Trump, like drain the swamp in Washington. He was going to do something different. But you just look at his background scratch that surface more than a couple of minutes, and you understand that he's actually nothing of the sort. He is very much an establishment character. So before he ran for office, he was the mayor of Davao City. Davao is the large city in the southern province of Mindanao. Mindanao is a large province which struggles against the Islamist insurgency mainly, and Davao City is the furthest from Manila, and I mean furthest in all senses of that word. It's furthest in administrative control. The mayor of that city is basically out of sight and out of mind, and can get away with an awful lot, and Duterte certainly did. And so before that, he was a lawyer. His father was a politician. This is somebody who's been around administrative politics in and around Davao all his life. His family are a clan. Filipino politics is based on clan politics, and that's not a stereotype to say. That still prevails, and he's very much from a powerful local clan based out of Davao. So he became effectively the first president ever from Mindanao, which itself was very, very intriguing. And I think that a lot of people sort of were on the fence whether to support him or not. Did give him the benefit of the doubt that this could be a real change candidate. But again, you look at his background, and he really was an establishment character. He trained as a lawyer, as I said, and for a long time kind of hung around outside the sort of local DA's office. Worked very closely with the police, which is very interesting when you look at his actual reign of power and how he has tethered himself to the security forces. And that, when you look at his history, goes all the way back to those days where hanging around the district attorney's office and making sure they were prosecuting the state's court cases in an efficient way, carrying favour with local police officers. Well, it's kind of his DNA, really, of operations, and we've seen that later when he did become president, how he brought the police chief from Davao with him to become the National Philippines Police Director, a guy called Bato, who has now become a senator in his own right and is even thinking of running for president. It's almost quite cliched, really.
Yeah,
he's not
yeah.
hiding. He's not hiding that trait, and it goes back to that trust and tethering of himself to, I've got your back, you've got mine, and there's an alliance there which is very, very difficult to break. And again, look, that is not unique to Duterte. Other clan members, other political leaders in the provinces do this, because what we call, in Filipino politics, we call it the phenomena of bossism, the big boss. And who of you that are like kind of listening that are familiar with it's a real cultural trait in Southeast Asia, actually, more broadly. Just let me just digress for a second.
Yeah.
If you
Go ahead.
if you've ever played the early computer games, the early platform games like the Nintendo and Sega games, at the end of a level, you would fight the big boss. Right, you would go one-on-one against somebody, and that was an eventual manifestation of a real cultural practice throughout Southeast Asia, in which local politics was dominated by a big boss. In fact, The Big Boss was the title of Bruce Lee's first ever film that he made outside of Hong Kong, a film set in Thailand. And it's the classic story of a local bad guy who maybe owns a factory and what have you, steals his girl, and you've got to get revenge off them. And while this is sort of become a trope, a cultural cliche, which has been replicated in video games and media and films and television, it's still very strong. And it's true in politics too. In some ways, it's a very much a mirror of life, cliched as it might feel now. And Duterte is an expression of that bossism, of that big bossism. He is the local big boss from Davao that went all the way to the presidency and became the big boss. And it's just, I was going to misspeak then. I was going to say it's funny how that plays out on the international stage. It's really not that funny, but it's interesting, it's strange.
If we talk about his presidency, then he wins power in 2016 with, I think, 39% of the vote. What are the big issues in the election that Duterte exploited to win?
I suppose his central platform was corruption, anti-corruption, which he's done an appalling job at. And it was literally it was nothing more than a facade to win votes. But, I mean, corruption means a lot of different things in the Philippines. He's completely right, and this is why it was popular. It is endemic. It has multiple different facets, from national to local politics. It affects everything from all the apparatus of state, from managing healthcare, which we've seen in COVID, education. I mean, there's an enormous layer of bureaucracy in the Philippines that government interferes with, but business also is inherently corrupt. He talked about he used language like, I'm going to bust up the oligarchs, change things. He also called himself a red. He said he was the first ever red president, by which he meant, a communist, which is just not true, but a socialist, somebody of the left. And he hoodwinked a number of rights leaders and rights groups into thinking this could be, somebody we've been looking at for a long period of time. And he promised heavily to engage the communist insurgencies and actually bring peace there. Again, I think he lost patience very, very quickly with that and completely reneged on those promises. But he did promise change around those two things predominantly. The other thing, of course, which maybe for international audiences is a bit more engaging at the time, was he promised to push back against China in the South China Sea. And this is where, the sensational elements of his politics came in. He promised to ride a jet ski to the various islands in the South Pacific, which the Chinese were approaching. And this is a guy that rides a motorbike and, he's a pretty physical guy, as old as he might be. It wasn't all of the cards that he would do something stupid like this, if not just more for a photo opportunity. But as soon as he assumed office, he, of course, completely forgot all this. whether it's the corruption, the oligarchs, the communists. It's the same with the South China Sea. He just completely forgot it, and if anything, cozied up to China. So
Sure.
those three things all promised change, and were quite positive and were popular, I think. To effect that change, they would need a strong character. They would need a strong leader, and strong leaders are popular in various different areas of the world, as I'm sure your sort of podcast series is noting. But in particular in the Philippines, where to hold the country together in such a fractured geography and get some of this change done, you are going to need a strong leader. So I think that was kind of his main key selling point.
So probably the thing that's attracted the most attention in the West is his attitude towards drugs. He's got a very hard-line approach to dealing with not just drug dealers, but drug users. It's very hard to measure the severity of these issues as an outsider to Filipino politics, especially if you can't imbibe foreign language media. How bad is the situation with drugs in the Philippines, and what's the nature of it? Is it to do with drug production, drug trafficking, drug abuse?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, how does one compare sort of this across different nations? I suppose there must be a way of doing this in prevalence. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to be churlish and say the Philippines doesn't have a drug problem. It does. Most countries do. I mean, I lived in Manila for a couple of years. I saw, destitute poverty in the country and what have you, but I never saw sort of open drug abuse in the streets, for instance. But the particular drug menace, as he labelled it and wanted to go after, was all around shabu, which is all methamphetamine,
Okay.
which was we're not talking about sort of classic heroin, cocaine, or what have you. It was a methamphetamine epidemic in his eyes, which needed to be gone after, and that does have particular idiosyncrasies again for the Philippines. So a lot of that is, you've all watched Breaking Bad, right? You've seen how meth is created in local laboratories using large raw materials. A lot of those raw materials came from China. The Philippines is an obvious transit route, so the smuggling in of those goods, those raw materials, could be done very easily. And there was a number of cases in the early years of the drug war in which large seizures were made, but were being enabled, let's say, by the security forces, by the ports authorities, and what have you. So the corruption was endemic, and the drug problem, such as it was being enabled through that very corruption in the Philippines. So, I mean, meth for sure has been processed and probably dealt on the streets and consumed. I would suspect that the vast majority of that produced meth is then exported elsewhere to other nations in which, the drug dealers would get more money for it, because obviously people on the streets in the Philippines are going to be able to pay you good money for that if you wanted to export your product. But nevertheless, yeah, there is an issue. But it was a soft and easy target for Duterte to go after. This wasn't you could never dress this up as some sort of policy-based campaign from him. He never cited, for instance, health records about the scourge of the drug menace. This was just something he labelled in a very cartoonish way, and never cited evidence.
And a law of order issue as well, right? Which fits with the picture that you've painted of him as almost like a sheriff.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a vessel by which he could then enable the security forces to clamp down, assert their authority, again, bond himself, his politics to the security apparatus of the state and say, go about your business under this guise of the war on drugs. I've got your back, and we won't be able to be separated from this, regardless of how bad the problem was. And of course, what quickly got international attention was the fact that these murders which were being done on the streets were just senseless. There was such a ferocity of volume. You had people just ending up dead on the street with a cardboard sign next to their body, which would label them as a pusher, a drug pusher, or a drug user, for instance. So nobody knows how that person was killed. Nobody's got any evidence that that was actually true, and it just went wild. So we got a huge wave of extrajudicial killings in the name of the war on drugs, perpetrated by who knows what. But there was obviously, it was a great cover for all sorts of different types of political violence to bleed out.
I think I read that he's killed more of his own citizens than any Southeast Asian leader since Pol Pot.
That could very much be true. I mean, a lot of the comparisons to the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines in the 70s and 80s have been made. But Marcos, his worst estimates, maybe only killed 3,000 people. And he's talked about, those times are talked about as, by the sort of elder generation of Filipinos now as the worst times. And they absolutely were. I'm not trivializing that in the slightest. But Duterte's tenfold. We're talking about 20 to 30,000 people. I mean, and just no inquiries, no records of this. It's all been swept under the carpet. It's a magnitude different of murder. And it's presidentially ordered. He's not even trying to cover this up. It's a campaign platform.
Proud of it.
Yeah, exactly. And it really has enabled him to cement that bond with the security forces. So it's muddy, but yeah, who knows where it's going to go in the long run. There's obviously an ICC investigation. I don't know if you wanted to discuss that and talk about that, but that's going to be very difficult for them to investigate that in the years to come. I mean, we're coming to the end of his presidency. This will be going on for 5 or 6 years. Those observers like me who've been sort of howling at the moon saying someone needs to pay attention, things need to be done about this. And now the ICC is, getting off its arse and doing something about it, but how is it going to do anything from afar when there was no local investigations, no evidence were gathered? You can't trust the police. They were the ones doing the murders. I mean, because, of course, running parallel to all those extrajudicial killings and vendettas and vengeance and vigilante violence were actual murders caught on body cam by the police who went out on raids. They created a kill list, effectively, the supposed victims and drug dealers higher up in the hierarchy they were going after, and they killed all sorts of innocent people in these drug raids. So there's that to investigate, but it's this is years in the passing now. Unless there would be people within the security forces which were going to turn on Duterte, which, his plan is entrenched. I can't really see that happening very easily. Then what is the ICC going to use for its investigation? It's going to be reliant on the Philippines cooperating, and that's a remote chance.
Yeah, I mean, something that I read when I was preparing for this was that in the Philippines you elect the president and the vice president on separate ballots.
That's right.
So, in theory, the president and the vice president can be of different parties, and that's the case now with Duterte. His vice president, Leni Robredo, is not from his party.
Correct.
Has that curbed his power very much in practice?
No. She has been a real thorn in his side, and she has, voiced dissent against his ways. And I was going to say maybe she has been able to curb him in the background, but I actually don't believe that. I mean, he's gone at it as hard as he wanted. The president does have an awful lot of power in the Philippines, especially once they have control of the security apparatus. And so while the Senate has a great deal of power, the Senate is very slow and cumbersome. It's also, again, he's not stupid. He populated the Senate with a lot of his acolytes as well. There was sort of some interesting moves early on, jockeying and manoeuvring amongst various senators that wanted to put themselves in the Duterte camp because they knew the next 5 years were going to be all about him. And very few people came out as opposition into the Leni Robredo camp in the Senate. And so, don't get me wrong, there's been a couple of, but they are very much minority voices in the Senate. You also need to remember that one of his biggest opposition figures and one of his first moves was to imprison Leila de Lima, who was she still is a senator, and she's going to run again from prison, and she's never had a day in court yet after 5 years. So he played, sort of divide and conquer politics in the most elementary level to get around that. And Leni Robredo, yes, she won the vice presidency. She's now going to run for the presidency, and a lot of sort of opposition hopes are resting on her to execute some of the reversals of these changes. And she might end up in the exact opposite position. She might end up president with a Duterte acolyte as vice president. But that it will be a complete reversal. That vice president will be able to speak on official record, but not really be able to affect anything at a policy level if the president doesn't want that.
You mentioned the importance of the security apparatus to the president. I mean, let's talk about a few security issues that the Philippines has then, Tom. I mean, one particular one that you've mentioned that he has to contend with is Islamic terrorism. Very early on in his presidency, there was an ISIS terror attack in Davao City, which obviously you mentioned. Duterte was the mayor of Davao City. Can you explain what Duterte has done about this issue, especially the events that happened in 2017?
Yeah, I mean, the country wrestles with two different insurgencies, the communist insurgency and the Islamist. We just divide it into the Islamist insurgency. Though making that division isn't easy. In some ways, they do overlap an awful lot, and if we talk about one without the other, to my mind, it's very abstract. But we in the West obviously have a common foe in Islamism and the war on terror, etc. So it's often what grabs all the headlines. I find it very hard to get anybody, press-wise interested in the communist insurgency, which kills more people. Nobody ever sort of wants to hear this, but there's more involved in that, and they are very much seen as the old enemy, the communists. I'll come back to that, but let's just focus on the Islamists for a bit. Duterte promised to do something about this. He said there were Islamists in his own family from Mindanao who he was going to use to reach out and do something about. It is a protracted issue. You have to go back in the history of this all the way back to the sort of founding of the Republic and the Second World War of the Philippines. And again, it's a very local issue to do with an awful lot of things. Something that's been going for 60, 70 years isn't down to one very simple thing. That the insurgency in the Philippines is fractured for a number of reasons, but ultimately you pin it down to an issue of representation. So the majority Muslim population in Mindanao there have never felt respected, recognised, or have much autonomy of their lives. And any neutral observer would agree with that. It's not a radical point of view to say they've got a damn case there. And then over certain periods of time, there's been various different approaches from Manila to be conciliatory towards them, bring them into the fold, give them a bit more autonomy over local politics down there, and then complete opposite approaches, really clamp down on that. Lots of checkpoints, exposure to military life for certain people in certain areas in Mindanao rubs up against them daily, and there's a constant antagonism against the idea of a Filipino state which is predominantly Catholic. So that doesn't go away in certain areas. And then obviously fast forward to sort of 9/11 and the sort of burgeoning of Islamic jihadism movements around the world, and the Philippines was all of a sudden somehow connected to this because they'd been fighting this for some sort of long period of time. But like I said, the conflict in the Philippines is very local. There are fringe groups in the Philippines which have been very quick to label themselves as international jihadists. Like they would appropriate the sort of label of Al-Qaeda previously and then ISIS and call themselves jihadists in the same way. But I think, close observer of the Philippines would always caution against that because you understand the history of the conflict. This was long-running and violent long before Al-Qaeda and ISIS came along. And it plays to the insurgents' interests to label themselves and inflate their scare tactics by appropriating an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda badge. And for many years, the security forces in the Philippines understood that as well, and always cautioned and that against this, and said, what's going on in the Philippines is very local. This isn't a jihadist thing. And then I thought, yeah, like you say, so very early in Duterte's administration, there was a complete about face, and it came straight from the president. There was a very awkward couple of days in which the defense secretary and intelligence chiefs were keeping to the party line of, no, this is a very local thing, it's not international jihadism, and Duterte was kind of trumping them, going, these are jihadists, this is ISIS, we've now got ISIS in the Philippines, we need to kill these guys very, very quickly, etc. And so as soon as the order came down from the president, the sort of whole security apparatus got in line behind them, and they pushed hard. They chased various of the small militants groups in and around Mindanao, and then so there was a siege in the city of Marawi. I think this is kind of what you were alluding to,
Yeah.
in which there was a full-on siege, basically, which lasted best part of a year and has left the city of Marawi, which is a large city, completely devastated. It's a very questionable use of force by the Filipino military. For instance, they used air power. They dropped bombs from planes. I was told with pretty good authority from sources within the Filipino military that they only had very limited guided ordnance, sort of laser-guided missiles which they could use, and they used them all up on the first day. And so for the rest of the year, they were dropping what effectively are called dumb bombs, in which there's no guarantee of where exactly that's going to land. You're talking, about the sort of standards of missile warfare that they were using in Vietnam. And so this just led to devastation of the city, lots of innocent lives lost, lots of carnage. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have documented what went on in that conflict and siege, I think, very well, and have accused the Filipino security forces, the military predominantly, of using force which was not proportionate and which was indiscriminate. Those are two things which breach international humanitarian law. Obviously, the insurgents were also in breach, using child soldiers and what have you, and people as shields and what have you, but one would expect that from terrorists, really. But the security forces' accusations have yet to be investigated, so it'll be interesting if the Duterte regime comes out of office, if those get a proper investigation, because they, like I say, were well evidenced and documented by those international monitoring bodies. And, you zoom out of that now and you ask yourself, well, where are we with the Islamist insurgency in the Philippines? We're exactly where we were. I mean, a couple of the fringe jihadist groups' leaders have been murdered, but again, that's nothing new. Over the past 20 years, leaders have been targeted and assassinated. The Philippines has had lots of assistance from the Americans in the counterinsurgency wars. They've been pretty damn good using drone warfare and what have you, of targeting the odd leader and killing them. But it's just cutting the head off a hydra. Somebody else replaces them, and the underlying groundswell of antagonism against the Filipino state doesn't go away. And so we still have a plethora of different Islamist groups, rivalries amongst each other and against the state, which it feels to me that Duterte, after the Marawi siege, has just given up on now. I mean, he obviously supports the security forces in their campaign against them, and there are obviously odd fringe attacks which happen, but we're no better or worse from where we were, really.
If we look at Duterte's foreign policy overall, Tom, he's made it quite clear that he wants the Philippines to have, as he's put it, an independent foreign policy. He wants to take back control of the country's defence and security arrangements. From what or from whom does he want to take back control?
The Americans is the easy answer to that. He used sort of an anti-imperialist rhetoric in a lot of his election campaign to say he would push back against the Americans. Threatened to sort of throw that alliance out and get more closely aligned to the Chinese and Russians. That never actually really materialised itself within the first couple of years. A lot of the senior Filipino military have been closely aligned with the US for generations. Duterte can't just change that overnight. A lot of the
Sure.
senior brass of the Filipino military would go to the likes of West Point in the US to get educated and do their degrees, and then come back. And then, like I said, there's lots of counterinsurgency close assistance with the US Special Forces. He can't give that up very easily, and so it was just a veneer, really of rhetoric. Underneath that, Duterte has done slightly different things, but not really in that anti-US imperialist model. So he has cozied up to China. He has completely reneged on the South China Sea thing. I mean, he talked large about bringing back some pride to Filipino sovereignty and asserting their rights there during the campaign, but that's just been completely washed because he thought he could get more out of China through a conciliatory approach with them. But elsewhere, I mean, he withdrew the country from other sort of international and diplomatic accords, severed some, or at least soured some relations with other local leaders. ASEAN, which is the local association of Southeast Asian nations, their effective version of the EU over there. He kind of shunned those in a couple of meetings and never really took that as a sort of serious method of engagement. Somewhat coming back to bite him now during the COVID saga, in which they could have done with a bit of a regional alliance. But, I mean, he withdrew the country from the International Criminal Court within a couple of years, thinking that would devolve him from any future investigation of the war on drugs. But that's not retroactive. So the country was a member of the International Criminal Court for the first year or so of his administration, and therefore the crimes committed within that first year he's still liable for. So they're no longer a cooperating member of the ICC. A new president might join up again. The Filipinos have got a long history of being involved in international dialogue around these issues, but he pulled them out, wanted to take its own path, didn't want that sort of Western liberal influence in the politics of his country. Again, popular with a certain brand of people, perhaps for a short term, but ultimately there's not been that much material change on the ground. You still have a strong cultural influence of the West in the Philippines, particularly the US. If you ever go there, the most popular sport in the Philippines is basketball. For a country which, I love them dearly and just in the most polite fashion, not the tallest people. US culture and politics, music, the rest of it is huge. He can't just take that out of the country overnight. This idea that somehow he could remodel the country in his own image was just fanciful.
I did a podcast on Erdogan recently, another very populist leader who's also shunned the Americans, incidentally. His attitude towards foreign policy is quite similar to Duterte's. He talks of the benefits of having an independent approach to foreign affairs. Lots of populists like Nasser, Perón, Hugo Chavez were part of the non-aligned movement, the countries that didn't side with either the Americans or the Soviets during the Cold War. What is it about populism and populists, do you think, that makes them embrace a non-aligned foreign policy so often? Because it's a very strong trend.
It is. But you know what? Again, I can only really, and I always try to do that. I think things are quite particular to the Philippines. So, in some ways, Duterte was right to push back against US influence. The Americans had exploited the Philippines for many years and used it as it was being known as the Pacific buffer for the US ever since you go back to Second World War and Pearl Harbor and what have you. The US has used the Philippines as its jumping off point to Asia, had lots of military bases, closed them down after Vietnam. Those military bases went derelict and became sort of dens of prostitution and child sexual exploitation. A lot of sort of retired military types still live there, and it's terribly seedy, and there's a huge problem which the US have never sort of have owned up to and done much about. And so it did take somebody to sort of say, you know what, we're sick of being sort of treated like this. But at the same time, what other options are there that are open? I mean, the Chinese and the Russians are hardly going to treat you much better. But Duterte tried to play a little bit of game of leverage and see exactly what extra he could get out of the Americans. This all happened along the backdrop of Obama's pivot to Asia, of like moving away from Afghanistan and Iraq and putting more influence back onto Asia. The Philippines, though, ultimately, other than offering still that jumping off point, exports very little in terms, other than its labour. It provides lots of NHS nurses in this country, in the UK, as well as around the world, domestic employment in the Middle East, etc. A lot of sort of sailors and nurses across various merchant navies around the world, which deliver remittances back to the country. It's a huge part of their GDP. It's hard for Duterte to leverage any of that in any sort of international negotiations. So this idea that they're non-aligned with somebody, that's quite difficult. I mean, globalization, like all nations, has tethered everybody to one another, and the Philippines is incredibly tethered because of that. Its labour is needed around the world, and therefore it can't fully become a pariah state if it needs those remittances to come back to the country. And so he dabbled, he dipped his toe in the various bits of these sort of dialogues to see what better deal he could get, which you can understand and I support to a certain degree. But he should have known this. Anybody that took 10 minutes to kind of think this through and game theory this out knew the Philippines had very few cards to play.
The picture you've painted of him overall is of a leader that's not particularly effective.
I'd agree with that. Yeah, so effective. I mean, he's been effective in terms of getting to power, holding on to power, and in some ways remaining popular whilst being in power, despite some of his policies. I mean, a lot of the surveys and polls have always seen him as being a popular leader. That I've always taken with a pinch of salt, though. Filipinos often do support their leaders in the same way that they've always looked for a strong leader. When a president is elected, they're often, at least for the first couple of years, very popular with the population. They want to get behind their country. They're quite a passionate and loyal people, and so that has held to Duterte as it has with many other leaders. I think as that's bled out, though, and decreased over time, particularly with what's happened in COVID the past couple of years, that's now starting to wane. Effective, I think that's shown over a number of different things. Obviously, I've talked about how he's failed basically with the counterinsurgency operations and the war on drugs. But, sorry to bring everything back to COVID. I mean, God knows that we're all sick of it.
Well, let's talk about the pandemic in the Philippines a bit, because you've mentioned it a few times. I mean, how bad has it been?
Again, I'm sure you can quickly Google some charts to compare that, but it's very, very bad. They've had no access to vaccines without getting them donated from rich countries. Effectively, their rollout, their early measures to try and stop the spread, so sort of lockdown measures and wearing of masks and what have you, were all very, very poor and bungled. Trying to be fair to them, it is going to be very difficult in a country where you've got slums, where you've got people living in close proximity in absolute poverty. Stopping the spread of a respiratory disease like this is going to be, virus like this is going to be very, very difficult. But there's been some corruption in the access to the vaccines, in the PPE equipment and what have you. So I don't think anybody's at all impressed with how Duterte is engaged with this. He was far too late and has not really been serious. This has really been one of the few areas in which Leni Robredo has been able to speak out and has looked like a compassionate and good leader on the health front, which I think will play well to her in the election.
So just to get back to Duterte finally then, Tom, he recently announced that he was retiring from politics. He's not a young man, it's worth pointing out. I think he's 76. Although given the current occupant of the White House, I'm not sure how much that matters anymore.
Good point.
Do you think we have seen the back of Duterte? And more importantly, have we seen the back of his politics? From what you've already said in our discussion, I would guess you think we haven't.
Yeah, you infer well. I think not only his age, but he's also has health problems himself. But throughout his tenure thus far, he's done a very obvious job in grooming his daughter, as well as a number of other people, into sort of roles to continue not just his policies, but making sure he has a voice through them. And so whether these sort of vessel candidates will continue to look to the father figure of the family to continue his brand of politics, I'm convinced in some way or another, whether that's from the president's office or the vice president's office, they're still going to have a lot of influence. So Duterte himself, may well retire from frontline politics, and he might go back to Davao and effectively enjoy his retirement for the next few years. But he has always been very clear that he wants to groom his son and his daughter for positions of influence, and now's the time really for that to cash in. So they aren't going to betray their father's name. They're not going to give him up to the ICC. They're not going to in some way undermine the war on drugs or any of his policies, really, because he is going to always be their guiding light, and I don't see how that's going to change.
I suppose also he is coming from or retiring into a position of relative popularity still. Maybe not the popularity that he had in 2016, but certainly he's got enough clout behind him. There are two other people who it might be worth mentioning at this point. One of them is the son of the former president, Ferdinand Marcos, who might be running for president. And
he is, yes. Bongbong Marcos, his son. He's definitely running for president. He's the front runner. Sadly, I would say, if you were going to put your money on, he's not the candidate I would vote for. I would vote for Lenny Robredo, but Bongbong Marcos is going to be a very difficult candidate to beat.
The other person that I've heard a lot about for years, really, in Filipino politics is Manny Pacquiao.
Indeed.
Who a lot of people will know not for his politics, but for his boxing.
Yeah.
Can you go a bit into the significance of those two people?
Well, Bongbong Marcos certainly aligns to the Duterte camp. He might be the presidential candidate and Sarah Duterte be the vice presidential candidate. So there'll be some continuity there under that ticket. Bongbong, the son of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos, which ruled, with a lot of US support, 70s and 80s, squandered billions of US dollars and Filipino pesos away, which have never been fully recovered into Swiss bank accounts. A terribly murky area of Filipino history, which is still in the lived memory of a certain generation of Filipino voters, and he won't be easily forgiven from that brand. But the demographics of the Philippines tell you that the vast majority of voters are young. I think the median age, last time I checked, is around 26 or 28. Most people didn't live through the Marcos era, and so sure they learned about him in school, but they don't have the same sort of visceral reaction as the older generation do. So there is an opportunity there for Marcos Jr. to exploit that a little bit and their ignorance, and he does have that celebrity name, and that will carry him an awful long way. Through notoriety, he's the outstanding candidate. By contrast, the Pacquiao candidacy is incredibly interesting. Anybody that's even remotely interested in sport or boxing for the past 20 years should really have nothing but admiration for Manny Pacquiao. His career in boxing across, I think it's 6 or 7 different weight divisions, starting as a flyweight, going all the way up to sort of the middleweight ranks, champion many, many times, fought some absolutely great fights, and always did this very humbly, was not sort of the Floyd Mayweather brand of braggadocious way of selling a fight. And also kind of a good representative of the Philippines. Later on moved into politics, so was a congressman, senator. So he's been at the politics as a part-time gig while being a boxer for the past decade or so now, and now he's taking a run at the presidency. Interestingly, though, over the last administration with Duterte, Pacquiao was close to Duterte. There were moments in the Congress in which Pacquiao did a lot of Duterte's bidding for him. There were opposition figures in the Congress which Pacquiao went after. Sort of under Duterte's allyship, they were very fond of one another. In the last year or so, that relationship has soured, though, and Pacquiao has moved away from Duterte. I think very wisely. I mean, Manny Pacquiao is obviously a multimillionaire, and I suspect he's probably getting advised by some Western, political gurus, and are telling him that, you have a great reputation in the West. If you want to continue with that and look like you are a sort of liberal reformer, if that's going to be your agenda, you should maybe move away from Duterte. And he looks to have done that, and their relationship really has soured just over the last 6 months as this election has started to ramp up a little bit. Pacquiao himself doesn't have much of an agenda yet to stand on, so it's a little bit early days to call how genuine a chance he's got. Again, he has a lot of money, has a lot of celebrity, he is popular, but I think there is an instant reaction that he's a lightweight candidate when it comes to the presidency. And so 6 months out from the election, I can't tell you really with any honest confidence of how well he's going to do it. He's just an interesting candidate who now currently kind of sits between the Marcos and Duterte camp on one side, and then the liberal wing by Lenny Robredo, the current vice president. Pacquiao is somewhere in the middle, not really aligned to both, which might play into his hands, it might not. But a very interesting figure.
I suppose he's got quite a low floor and a high ceiling as a candidate in a way, because there's not an awful lot of baggage politically there. But equally, from what you've said about both Duterte and Bongbong Marcos, it could be very easy if you tried to imitate them to sort of get lost in the political fray and almost be seen as not different enough to them.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. He has got some baggage, but it remains to be seen yet how much he's going to get dug up. Like I say, he did a little bit of the dirty work for Duterte just recently, which is a little bit been forgotten. There's a senator which has been languishing in jail for the entirety of Duterte's reign, Lila de Lima. She was exposed on the Senate floor with an awful crusade against her. She's a very liberal former chair of the Human Rights Commission. And Pacquiao led that, threatening to show a sex tape which Duterte apparently had of her. And that there needs to be some scrutiny and accountability on there. He famously cheated on his wife as well. And in the Philippines, where they're a Christian and marriage is sacrosanct, that was a big deal. We're almost going back a decade ago to that. That seems to be being forgotten, but I suspect in the next few months, both the Duterte camp and the Robredo camp will raise these issues and see if the electorate takes any accountability of Pacquiao, because he hasn't been tested. He has been put on the pedestal. He is the sort of Filipino hero, and nobody will want to, muddy him easily. I think people that will do that will look like sourpusses. So he might get an easy ride, maybe, if he's not considered a threat. So he's an odd candidate. He doesn't sit well between those two camps.
That's really interesting. I think it's going to be a really. I'm not sure consequential is quite the right word, because from what you said, it sounds like continuity is going to be the order of the day, to the extent that it always is in most countries. On a slightly less political note, Tom, just to finish the podcast, you used to work in Manila. I think the Philippines isn't a country that many people get to visit. If people are lucky enough to visit there, where do you recommend they go?
Oh, great question. Beautiful, brilliant country. After COVID, let's hope that all goes away. Maybe after the Duterte regime relinquishes some power, and the war on drugs is makes the place less dangerous to visit, and it's a bit more hospitable. I can't think of many better places that I'd ever recommend people. I had a great time there, made some of the best friends. People who had nothing offered me everything. Were very hospitable and welcoming. I mean, just the geography of the place. You've got the best beaches, the best islands. I would get out of Manila. Manila is an experience to be had, but not massively positive. I would head south as much as possible. Mindanao can be a difficult place to travel. That's where the insurgencies rage. And you do have to be closely aligned with what's happening in the news, because that is off limits for certain periods when there's flares in violence. But I would head south to some of these smaller islands. There's an excellent city which has a university called Dumaguete City, which I used to love and hang around a lot there. There's a small island called Siquijor Island, which is the home of supposed witchcraft in the Philippines. And you're the only tourist when you're there. You can hire a motorbike, see the island. It's both wonderfully exotic and wonderfully hospitable and homely at the same time. It's not on the usual backpacker trail of Southeast Asia like Thailand and Cambodia and what have you. It's a little bit more difficult to get to, but what comes with that are an awful lot of rewards. You will have the place to yourself. It's awfully cheap. There is such a vibrant and interesting politics and sociology to the country. Even if you go head up to the north to the mountains, it's like you're in a different place entirely. So I can't recommend it enough. For as much as the trouble in politics, which I often end up talking about, I do, as much as possible, try to encourage Westerners to visit as much as possible.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom. This has been a really thorough 360 view of a country that doesn't get a lot of coverage in Western media. So thank you very much. Where can people find your work?
So if you check out my University of Portsmouth profile page, just type in Google Tom Smith Portsmouth, you'll find me. My Twitter handle is Tom the Academic, and I tweet fairly irregular on certain stuff. I will write for most platforms about Filipino stuff. That's probably going to ramp up a lot in the next 6 months around the election. So The Conversation, The Diplomat magazine, The Guardian occasionally. So on these sort of platforms, you'll hear me discussing the interesting characters.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. Enjoy the
Cheers,
rest
Tom.
of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.